Good afternoon, everyone. How are we doing? Good, excited. My name is Sergio Loza, and I am an assistant professor in the Department of Advanced Languages and director of the Spanish Heritage Language Program here at the UL. And first, I would like to welcome everyone to Olivia Mel's Defense Thesis Honors Defense. Today, she is presenting her project titled The Sociolinguistic Complications and Present Implications of English-Spanish Legal Interpretation. In the Department of Romance Languages, we very much pride ourselves in preparing our students so that they can gain a critical, analytical mindset, a skill, a set of tools to understand language in a social context. Language is something that I think is so very much taken for granted by people, by us. Yet it is something that makes us who we are as both individuals and as members of our various communities. So take it for granted, but so crucial and central to who we are as people. Olivia's defense today, in my opinion, speaks to this important relationship by casting a critical eye on language in the courtroom. I have had the pleasure of being Olivia's professor for 2, maybe 3 courses, I can't remember, but for sure 2. And I have also worked with her very closely during her thesis writing process, and it's been a delight. Thank you for being a good student. During this time, I've come to admire Olivia's hard work ethic, her intelligence, her empathy, and dedication to having a positive impact on the world. And there is no doubt in my mind that she will go on to fulfill her goals, her dreams, and to become a successful immigration lawyer. Well, that's the plan for now, right?
Yes. Very much so.
And that she will most certainly bring a positive impact on good people's lives. Olivia is, in fact, my very first honors thesis student. So I'm so very happy and impressed with her work. So to her friends and her family that are here today and in support of her, you all should be very proud of her. And so with that, I'll let you take it away.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you guys all so much for being here. I'm so excited that you all made it. I'm assuming you drove a little further than others to be here, but it means the world to me. I'm super excited to show you what I've been working on for the past year and a half. Let's turn on the power here and get this going. It should be ready. It's going to take a minute. There we go. So, as Rosa already said, this is the title of my work. I'm not going to say it because I'm going to stumble over it. But I've been working on this for about 15 months now. And one of the things that I loved about this project is that I've been learning as I was studying. It was very much a project that I didn't know what implications and like the final elements of what I wanted to say were going to be as I was researching, but they very much revealed themselves as I was studying language and people and how important Spanish is in the United States. So, jumping right in. An example that really motivated me when I started working on this project, I was just reading through articles and I found a case of a man who walked into a courtroom, he'd run a red light, and he just went to go and contest his ticket. And instead of being sat down and said he was in there for a traffic violation, he was told that he was in there for violación. And violación sounds a lot like violation. It translates to rape. It's a felony. Very much a different charge and a very jarring experience for this individual to walk in and think, I'm just going to contest my ticket, and all of a sudden there's a felony on my head. How did we end up here? And it's because his interpreter was completely underqualified to be there. This was only a couple years ago. It happened in Virginia. These kinds of things keep happening. It's 2024, it's 2016, it's the 21st century. Interpretation needs to actually match the standards of the people that we're having because a felony charge is a pretty big deal. So, to kind of break into what I was studying specifically, my research questions, I had 4 central questions, 4 central chapters. I looked at the linguistic elements and social history. So what is the language of Spanish? And what's the social history of Spanish in the US that makes legal interpretation different and more complicated compared to just day-to-day translating if you're in a drive-through. I looked at standard pitfalls, issues, how interpreters are qualified, and the resources they have for being an interpreter, things they can refer to, what they can look at. I looked at the implications, right? What's the need of this? Why does it matter? What's at stake if the interpretation goes wrong for the rights of a Spanish speaker? And then I kind of looked at the educational standards and systems. How can we improve them? What needs to change? So I've got that, and then kind of an overview, because I've got a lot to cover in a short amount of time. My literature review. This is just a brief history of Spanish in the US. The people who speak it, where they are, the fact that they live here, that they're very present. Then I jump into sociolinguistics. I talk about all the linguistic features, all the jargon, all the stuff that isn't as important to us, but is important if you're writing a big paper. Structures and ideologies, government systems, how do you get qualified? Who does it? What do they think of it? How do you perceive language? I went into case studies. This was probably my favorite part. 3 categories of real-world misinterpretations, a handful of excerpts actually analyzing here's what they did wrong, and how do we make that better? Actually looking at pieces that we can identify, because as much as it's great to say this needs to change, it's so much better to look at it and say this is what needs to change, and we can specifically attack those issues and come up with solutions. My final portion, which was the recommendations to improve accessibility and to make interpretation better. So jumping in, literature review. I'm gonna go through this fast because it's 200 years of history. We got the Mexican-American War and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. What happens here? Mexican territory was annexed. The entire northern half of Mexico was taken by the United States, and all the people who lived there were thrown up in the air. At this point, their land was reappropriated. They were offered citizenship with extremely minimal benefits that were not the same as their white counterparts. Their language was not valid. Their land documents, anything saying, I own this, that doesn't matter anymore because it's in Spanish. And ideology at the time was English is the language of the United States. We see that even worsening as it comes into here, the Bracero program and Operation Wetback. Both of these are opportunities to take advantage of Mexican labor, undocumented Mexican labor. Operation Wetback was when they said that they don't want that labor anymore. So they brought all these people in on trains, and then they said, actually, no, get out of our country. And so it was a process of taking their land, taking their people, and pushing them out at will. Very selfish, absolutely nothing to do with the well-being of the Mexican people. Then we see some actual legislation come onto the scene in the 60s for the first time. This is the Immigration and Naturalization Act, which pretty much criminalized undocumented labor in the US. So in that sense, it protected people from the Bracero program kind of initiatives that took advantage of these laborers, but it also made it really difficult for anybody who was already here, because now you have the issue of undocumented presence. One case that I found in my research that I found extremely interesting, ex-Raleigh Ron versus United States. He was a Puerto Rican native. Court verified that he only spoke Spanish, so he needed interpretation, and he was convicted of second-degree murder. In his trial, he was provided absolutely no interpretation outside of some spotty offerings from a bilingual prosecutor. There were 14 witnesses that testified against him in English, and he sat there for 3 days of trial and had no idea what anyone was saying, and he was convicted. That was like 50 years ago. Getting even more recent, we have the Immigration Reform and Control Act and the English-only laws. This is where the government starts saying, okay, we recognize that there is a Latinx presence in the US. We want to crack down on it. We want them to go away. We don't want them here. We don't want their Spanish. And so it becomes even more aggressive in the sense of trying to eradicate people by making them unwelcome socially so that they will choose to leave on their own. Now, what we're looking at, what a lot of my study focuses on, is this 21st century, the growth of the population, and these awarenesses that are more critical of language and race that are coming into where we are now, because it has been very evident that Latinx populations are not going away. This is the growth in just the last 21 years. About 35 million to over 60 million people, and the majority of them are born in the US. So these aren't immigrants, these are our own citizens. So whose rights are we taking away? Our own citizens who were born here and have just as much right to a court trial that's fair as anybody else. So when it comes into the language piece, sociolinguistics, I picked out 3 big linguistic elements. It's a little jargony, but basically lexicology, your vocabulary. A big issue here is false cognates, like that example, right? Violación, violation. Sounds really similar, super different meaning. Can't mix that kind of stuff up. Semantics, what do you mean, right? I can say wild, but that could mean crazy, or that could mean actually like uncivilized. Do you know what the word means and in what context? And then the equivalency, which is a huge debate in these linguistic discourses about accuracy and accessibility. Are we being specifically correct? Are all of the words perfect? Or are we making it accessible to people so that it's functional at its basic level? One of the reasons I chose sociolinguistics to study the issue of interpretation is because it creates, I love this quote, not so much a better understanding of how language is structured, but a better understanding of how language is used, right? Not so much what it is as what it's for. Because that's the issue here, is that language is for the people, and people are testifying, people are in courtrooms, people are in social spaces, and if we're too focused on structures and the nature of it, and we're not looking at real lived experiences, we come up with the problems that we have in our current interpretation system, where the standard doesn't match and people aren't being heard. I also looked at the specific sociolinguistic elements, kind of taking what we saw in linguistics and applying it to the people. In Spanish, you will find anglicisms. These are words produced by language contact, like the word in Spanish for rent is alquiler officially, but the word rentar is oftentimes used in the US, or renta. That's a word that's been produced as a product of English and Spanish existing in the US. Somebody who lives maybe in really far South America may not be accustomed to the word rentar. They may use alquiler, but both of those words are valid, and both of those words are used in the United States because we have such a high population of Spanish speakers in this country. Then there's code switching, super common bilingual behavior, where you'll see people start one sentence or one phrase in one language, and they'll finish it in another. And it's because they have that fluidity between two languages, that they're comfortable to speak both. That's also valid, and it pops up in the courtroom. Social perspectives. This is another big one, and it's kind of the greater part of sociolinguistics, where language is a societal signifier, right? What does speaking Spanish mean? If you're speaking Spanish in the United States, if you're speaking Spanish in a courtroom, what is someone going to think of you for using that language? If somebody on the stand is not white and is not speaking English, what are the societal perceptions that are going to be posed onto them just because of their identity that are discriminatory and putting them at a disadvantage? Structures and ideologies, that very much ties into that, in the sense that there are quite a few barriers to interpretation. We go through these quickly with a decent amount of text, but the big ones are the codified protections. You got some amendments. These are essentially saying you have the right to interpretation. Federal Court Interpreters Act, which was only established in 1978 after U.S. ex rel. Legrand, after somebody literally went through a murder trial with no interpretation. The government went, oh, maybe we should have a law saying that you're supposed to have interpretation. No. So they made some standards under the Federal Court Interpreters Act, controlled by the administrative office. However, the standards require no sociocultural colloquial knowledge. There's no need for you to know that renta means alquiler, or alquiler means rent in English. None of that is specified, and so there's no knowledge of the terminology that most of Spanish speakers in the United States are actually using day to day. And then again, you've got a regulation issue. They're not actually making sure that their interpreters know what they're doing on a day-to-day basis. And then the third issue, appealing errors. There's so much discretion regarding the validity of an interpretive error, like in that first case I talked about. It's treated as evidence and not testimony or a court proceeding where they really take it into consideration. And furthermore, the official court transcripts are only provided in English. So if you're looking at a court transcript going, did you make a mistake? There's no way to know because there's no evidence that it was ever made. You only get the English version of what was said. Then you look at how a lot of those issues make sense when you look at the ideology of the court and how they approach language. According to the courtroom, you're just supposed to translate and you're not supposed to interpret. If you're interpreting for someone, you're not supposed to interact with the person. You are supposed to operate as a machine. You're a robot and a third party. But you're interpreting someone's personal testimony of a crime that was committed against them. There's going to be some emotion in there. And if that doesn't get communicated, there's going to be a disconnect. So, research, on the other hand, quite literally says that word-for-word translation can only lead to misunderstandings, as languages may not have one-to-one replacements, right? You're not always going to have things that are perfect, because we're dealing with language. If you want language that has interacted with multiple cultures, multiple countries, multiple people groups, you need to have flexibility in this, and the court does not allow for that, meaning interpretive error is bound to happen, as we see in case studies. Objection. There is absolutely no system for catching interpretive errors in the courtroom. That example I gave you at the beginning was because there happened to be a bilingual professor from a local university sitting in on that trial. And she went, you made a mistake. There's no way that they would have otherwise found out. And the only other way would be if, the person themselves who is speaking Spanish has some bilingual proficiency and could say, I don't think that English word is right. And even at that point, they could be disqualified for needing an interpreter because they're using English. These case studies, if they want to work, I did 3 big study areas. The first one that I had a couple excerpts from was incomplete interpretation. This is just straight up not knowing what you're doing. Interpreters adding or subtracting parts of a Spanish speaker's statement. This could be adding like a stutter, taking out certain words that they repeat because you don't think that's a necessary thing. Any form of interpretation that does not actually match what was said. The other one is courtroom bilingualism. This is code switching, English use, and anglicisms, words that are produced by contact. This is very challenged in the court, and a lot of times you'll find interpreters who don't validate the words that bilingual or partially bilingual speakers use, and then you have more interruption and problems happen as a result of that interpretation. And the last one is narrative fragmentation. This is definitely more of a systemic thing that I was studying, where courtroom dynamics and systems have a compound effect on interpretive quality, because obviously if someone's interrupting you to interpret, there's going to be some flow that gets messed with. But when you add that in light of a long social history, you have dark colored skin, you're speaking a different language, right? There's a lot of elements that are coming in here. And so it's not just the fact that it's fragmented, it's that it's fragmented in light of A, B, C. My reduced interpretations, I have a couple examples here. Incompleteness, bilingualism. Oh my gosh, this one is really interesting. So the attorney asked approximately how many, aproximadamente cuántos. The witness responded in Spanish, un promedio de 21. And the interpreter said, probably an average of 21 people. This happened in 2017. The witness did not say or probably. But in this interpretation, they added the words and probably. It was an average of 21 people. But the interpreter added those words and made the person speaking sound like they didn't know what they were doing, completely destroying their credibility, and they're not able to actually communicate with the jury, the judge, and make their statement. Then there's bilingualism. The issue, this was an it was a housing case. The claimant said that she is on the lease, ella está en la lease. The arbitrator said, do you have your lease with you? And the interpreter translated that question, está con su contrato de arrendamiento. And the claimant, who spoke Spanish, responded yes. So you can see that this person spoke some Spanish and some English. The word lease was used both by the claimant and the arbitrator, but the interpreter invalidated their anglicized term, a lease, and went contrato de arrendamiento. That's like the official word, right? It's like alquiler versus renta. And they're completely invalidating them, and the claimant even responds with a yes, like, yeah, I know what you're saying. I know what renta means. I know what contrato de arrendamiento is. Don't invalidate how I'm saying this, because I know what I'm saying, and this is working and it's functional. Third example, this one's a lot of text, but the fragmentation is essentially, as you can see, it looks chaotic because it was. The interpreter and the claimant were not in sync with how they were talking. The person speaking didn't stop at any point, because when you're having interpretation, you need the other person to stop so that they can translate the phrase, then you go back, and then you interpret the phrase, and they weren't doing that. And so what you see at the end of this, they were trying to essentially say that they wouldn't open the door, there had been too many problems to break the United case. But you can't see what happens here, and it leaves a ton of confusion. And then again, compounding it with other elements in the courtroom, that fragmentation is going to have a much stronger effect. And the oldest of these cases, 2015, so 9 years ago. All of these are pretty recent. This one, 2021. So, to kind of bring it all back to the point of why it matters, because you can read a bunch of really cool information and do absolutely nothing with it, and that's not what I'm here to do. Remember this? If you look at the actual data behind that chart, you'll see that the population from 2000 to 2021 has grown 78%. 68% of that growth is US born. So again, these are not just immigrants. There are immigrants, but these are our young people. And people will make this an issue of immigration rights, of citizenship rights, and it is. But even more so, this is an issue of the people who were born in our country, raised in our education systems, grew up with your kids, right? This is not an immigration issue. This is a basic constitutional rights issue, because you have the right to interpretation, you have the right to a fair trial. And these people are part of our community. 19.1% of the United States population is Hispanic. Pretty good chunk. As I said, 68% of this population is natural born citizens, and yet 23% of the US prison population is Hispanic. How much of that might be because they didn't get their trial? Right? If we know that there's issues in interpretation that research has already showed, and we're still not doing anything about that number, you can blame that on a couple of other things, but 19% and 23%, that's pretty obvious that that's not how that should be. So, what do we do? I looked at two different ways, not to fix, but to start remedying this issue, because this isn't something you can fix in a day. Educationally, you need to get interpreters learning sociolinguistic elements of Spanish in the United States. You have to know the history. You have to people. You have to know that there's language contact. That words like renta are going to be used, and that violación doesn't mean violation. You're going to have there's false cognates that you're going to fall into these words, and you're going to think that maybe this is the right word, but no. You need to do the research. You need to take the time and study, because you're legally interpreting. This is somebody's future. This is somebody's criminal record. And you have to know that history in order to be able to properly see those for those other two things. And then I looked at systemic issues, of which there are many. There needs to be better interpreter accountability to catch the errors. There needs to be a third party in that room who speaks both, who can go, hey, I don't think that was the right word for that, whether that's in the moment or in a review afterward. You need to have Spanish in the transcripts, because you can't find an error if nobody records it. The only reason the errors I showed you in case studies were recorded is because a researcher sat in that courtroom and interviewed people. And we can't have a researcher in every room. We need to have the system automatically keeping track of these things so that we can make improvements. And as I said, you need to raise the standards to be a qualified courtroom interpreter. As of right now, you need 2 years of college language study. That's like passing through Spanish levels 200 for anybody who's gone to college. And that is not enough to translate somebody's murder trial, in my opinion. There's a lot more detail, there's a lot more emotion, there's a lot of people, soft skills, hard skills. You don't have any of that if you can't speak the language on the most basic level, let alone the sociolinguistic piece of literacy. So, yeah, that's what I've been up to. Thank you. Questions?
Yeah, so logistically how this is going to go from here is we'll just open it up for a time of open questions from the audience. And then when we're all questioned out, we have all the answers we want from Olivia, we'll ask everybody to leave the room, including Olivia, so we can deliberate and talk, and then we'll bring her back in and make our final decision. So we'll go ahead and open it up now for questions from anybody in the audience.
Is there one specific regulatory body that would be responsible for making and implementing these changes, or that can be held accountable or not?
Yes, that would the Administrative Office of the Court of the United States. That's essentially the agency that's been tasked with doing this under the Federal Interpreters Act of '78. That was what they established, that essentially the head of that agency is responsible for making the rules, establishing, and enforcing. They've established them. They're kind of shoddy what they have established, and what they have established isn't being enforced. So I would say if there is a guilty party in this sense for the systemic issues, it would be that office, because they're not matching what's needed.
Thank you.
Is there any consistency between states? If it's not a federal case, or if it's a local thing?
Yeah, local interpretation is the most problematic of all of them. Obviously, if you're in a small town in the middle of nowhere, Iowa, and you have somebody who's been working on a farm who gets injured and they have to sue for it, you're going to have you're going to have a really hard time finding somebody who can interpret for you properly, especially considering all of the dialect influences that could be on their language, that could be on the interpreter's language. When you get into smaller cities, smaller spaces, interpretation quality goes down. If it's a huge televised case, yeah, the government's not going to put a bad interpreter on that. That's got a lot of visibility. But it's those small state cases that the example that I opened with was a small case in Virginia. Small claims court was a traffic ticket. And so there's no real enforcement. Again, there's no system for catching the errors. There's no system for docking interpreters. If they make those errors, it's just like, oh, oops. It's a little bit more of an oh, oops. But yeah, there's really not much regulation and consistency.
If the defendant has an attorney who is bilingual, and also friendly to the defendant because they've hired them, can that person function in the interpreter role, or does there always have to be a third-party objective interpreter?
It's best for the court. I believe you can petition to have your attorney do it. It's best if you have a third party, especially because you are working with a jury and a judge, and the alteration of statements is already enough of an issue. Plus, if you're the attorney, you're doing a whole lot of your own work on your own. You can make a lot of money if you can do both, but I think from what I've studied, it's best to have a third party. And the government is a lot more likely to approve one of their federally certified court interpreters, even if you are both an attorney and a federally certified interpreter, because bias can come into it. And of course, allegedly, the court is to be as unbiased as it possibly can be.
With such a varied body of Spanish speakers in the US and lots of different variants because everyone comes from different places, did you find anything in your research about considering those differences across the US and in small local courts, like you said, or do you have any ideas about the best way to combat those kinds of challenges?
Yeah, as I'm sure you probably know too, the studies that have been done on New Mexican Spanish specifically, super cool, super interesting the way that that dialect has developed. It's very much its own language. Dialectal study, I think if you're going to be a federally certified court interpreter, you should be familiar with the dialect of your area. There's going to be a different kind of Spanish that you're going to speak in Miami to a different kind of Spanish you're going to speak in New York to where you're going to speak in LA, but you're going to speak in Texas because it's influenced by different populations, be that from who has immigrated there, be that from who was born there, be that from the English they interacted with, right? There's so many pieces that go like this because language and people exist together. There hasn't been a lot on that. They don't even work with sociolinguistic and dialectic study for basic interpreters. I think that's an excellent next level to force interpreters to be like, okay, now you know about sociolinguistics, you know about language contact, we're aware of this. Okay, now what are the people that are actually walking into your court going to speak? Are they going to say mental or are they going to say ocular? And why does it help you know that? Because it's going to be in all of those courts, and that's where most of these cases take place. It's not a bunch of big federal televised trials. It's traffic tickets, and it's small claims. Yeah.
Is there such a thing as a Spanish-English dictionary or glossary of legal terms? So that somebody who goes in for a traffic ticket doesn't get accused of rape? Because I'm assuming there are terms that are used in the courtroom that might be unique English words.
Yes, very much so.
So that somebody who's got 2 years of Spanish could at least open up a book and get the correct thing.
Ideally, yes. There are, I included this in my research. I didn't put it in the presentation because studying dictionaries is not everybody's jam, but it was very much, they do have a handful of dictionaries. There are about 5 of them that are very well known and very famous. Miriam Buendia Castro, she's one of the researchers who studied, like she compared all these dictionaries and looked at them and was like, okay, here's what we've got. Is it functional in terms of, is it correct? And is it useful that an interpreter could actually open it and be like, shoot, what's the word for rent? And look through it. And the hard part is the dictionaries that exist are not only sociolinguistically uninformed, they don't have those kinds of language contact terms. It's all the formal, right? So if you sit in Spanish class and they teach you vosotros, and you're like, am I going to use vosotros in the United States? Maybe not. That might be more useful in Spain. So it doesn't have the terms that are relevant, and then it's not organized in a way that's useful, right? Like you can command F PDF, super helpful because you can look up what you need. These dictionaries are organized in super different ways. There's no standardization. It's not like an index. It's not alphabetical. And so they need to actually write about, in my recommendations on the research side of my paper, about how they need to kind of revamp these dictionaries and look at it and go, what words are we missing? What words are being used that we don't see in our dictionary? Because there are those resources, but they're hitting like 60, 75% of what they need to hit in order for them to truly be useful for an interpreter to do their job well.
Is that going to be your post-grad project?
No, well, please after that. Yeah, sorry. No.
Are you aware of, maybe it isn't there, ways that we're trying to leverage technology or even AI to address some of these, or at least, in retroactively, meaning if they're happening?
Yeah, technologically, a lot of the dictionaries, thankfully, they've made digital publications link you to the internet. AI, unfortunately, is not a great tool when it comes to language. Could be. But as of right now, especially when you go into sociolinguistics, it's all these people interactions, it's human to human, you have your own kinds of ways of speaking, and you're not going to find those kinds of really human, gritty, almost what would be categorized as informal or not proper, but it's a perfectly fine way of speaking and it makes sense. Those kinds of ways of speaking aren't going to be picked up by an AI generator. I think a dictionary that's made online, that's made accessible, would be a great resource if it's actually filled with the kind of terms we need to have. And AI, maybe 20 years, we'll check back in.
I might have just missed it when we were talking about fragmentation. Like, how would you suggest remedying that idea of like breaking it up because it is like a back and forth?
Totally.
You know, sometimes like I hear it and I'm like tuning out because I'm like, wait,
Uh-huh.
you know, back and forth.
Well, then you're back and forth.
Yeah.
Anybody who's bilingual is like, wait,
Yeah.
you're hearing things. Yeah, fragmentation is one of the things about interpretation that is the hardest to solve, I would say. There have been some really interesting things that they've tried in UN, because obviously United Nations, you're gonna have a lot of languages.
Mm-hmm.
What they do there is instead of doing like that pause and start, I'm forgetting the technical terms for it, they do consecutive interpretation instead. So it's I'm talking and I'm not stopping. So my flow of speech is continuing, and while I'm talking, somebody else is talking at the same time. So I'm speaking to this interpreter, and there's multiple interpreters doing this so that things don't get missed. So they have maybe 3, now it requires a lot more manpower, right? But you get a higher quality because you have more manpower. That's really the only other thing I found in my research as a solution. And even then, you're dealing with people. There's going to be some issues. The main thing I found for relevancy of fragmentation was that it's an added barrier, right? It's like a list of 5. And so if we can get that down to maybe 2, ideally just the fragmentation being what gets interpretation messy between English and Spanish, that would be ideal. That's a good question.
I was wondering if any of the research focused on how gender driven it is. There was like any higher rates for like women of color.
Yeah, I stuck mostly to gender neutral with a lot of my study. I use Latinx throughout the paper because there's a lot of different genders that are represented in the courtroom and a lot of different gender identities. However, the legal field is very male dominated, just in general. I did find a few more reports of female interpreters, but a lot of the people who were, all of those cases I presented to you with the misinterpretations, those were all men speaking. So it does seem like there's a much higher rate of men who are ending up in a courtroom and being interpreted for, and a lot of them are having a female translator, or excuse me, female interpreter, those are not the same thing. And so I'm not sure how that plays into it. This was much more studying issues of the linguistics and systems, but there is no doubt that that definitely plays into it. As we've seen studies of like just the fact that the legal field is more male dominated. And so if you're a woman in there, there's going to be another layer, yet another layer of what's coming against you that you have to prepare for, and hopefully have an interpreter who's willing to mediate.
You touched on different cultures having different words, and I think we know that Spanish doesn't, it's not the same from one country to another, one subculture. Are all cases treated just as a Spanish speaker? So do you just get assigned a interpreter who speaks Spanish regardless of if you're from Argentina or Venezuela or Mexico or wherever the particular localization would be?
Yeah, they don't account for dialect, they don't account for nationality, they don't account for language contact, they don't account for, I mean, some of the studies I read didn't even list a name or gender, it's just anonymous, because there's so little detail on general sociolinguistic awareness that even diving into those specificities it's important, it's needed. It's one of the biggest issues that we're seeing is that you're getting the translator for, oh my gosh, which case study was it? The Contrato de Arrendamiento in place of Renta. That was a 50-year-old Cuban man translating for a bilingual United States citizen. And so also, how does that play into it, right? You have different demographics and dynamics there as well. So there's a lot of ways that needs to be improved because dialect, nationality, if you speak Spanish, you're lucky to even get somebody in person, let alone on the phone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I have a question for you about one of your recommendations, and I think it ties into one of your answers from a previous question too, of talking about how in Europe they have more manpower to have multiple, I don't want to say the wrong word, translator, interpreter.
You're fine.
So my question is, in one of the recommendations under systemic issues and what we can change moving forward is raising the standards of the qualified courtroom interpreter.
Yeah.
And I'm interested in your research. I mean, it would be great if this could be implemented, and it kind of raises the question, why isn't this implemented? And so I'm curious if there were other systemic issues that led to that systemic issue, if it's just a matter of it's difficult to make changes in the courtroom, or if there's other issues like time, money, and resources that are systemically not present that we need to be addressed in order to address that present need.
Yeah, that's very much like looking at, like, is this the branch or is this the root of the tree? Where the problem starts and how to actually get to the root of it so that it can grow out to be healthy. When it comes to raising standards, you are working with a gigantic public federal agency, so speed is not priority number one, let alone priority number 50. I think one of the reasons that there, like what I can see from my research with the GAP is that a lot of the laws that have been advocated for and that have passed, the last one we're seeing is like the 70s, like 78, 80. That's about the last time they really made any new updates to their standards. They've been doing some small administrative rules that federal agencies can say this is how you do it, but they're small and they're detailed, have the force of law, but they aren't enforced well. And so I think ultimately it comes down to the issue of manpower. There are not enough people who work for the administrative agency of the Office of the Court of the United States who are actually able to review this. They're not going into the courtrooms, they're in their office building doing their job. And they're not sitting in a courtroom and watching the actual experience of a Spanish speaker when they're misinterpreted. We're actually seeing the consequences of what happens to them. And so we have a lot of research, and I can't tell you how many times that crossed my mind, but this is like, it's already here. The research is sitting here. And yet our interpretation system still looks like this. Like, all we gotta do is bring it together. Like, come on guys. But there's not the manpower for it. And so I think as much as it would be wonderful to raise the standards, getting a law passed, improving a standard, then we're losing interpreters, right? Then we're gonna have the issue of, well, then we're gonna have even less, and we already have a manpower shortage. So why would we get rid of interpreters? So it's much more an issue of who there is to fix it, how many, and what it costs.
Can you go back to the example of arrendamiento?
Yeah. Not there.
It didn't even occur to me until today, actually, that that's a recast.
Yeah, it's a complete linguistic recast.
It's a correction by the interpreter to the defendant, right?
Because the claimant originally, I stopped in the lease.
But it's like an indirect correction, it's not explicit.
It's super like, oh yeah, I stopped in, like, and it's very also validating, both to the court of saying like, this is how he should be speaking, and to the speaker themselves.
Well, my question is, what if you could kind of expand a little bit, what do you think is the negative consequence of being in the courtroom, right, relying on interpretation, someone speak for you, right? You know, sociolinguistically that when you're in a state of stress or excitement or you're using a vernacular, you're not paying attention to character speech, you're not speaking formally, right? And to have an interpreter who you're relying on doing direct correction, what do you think is the moment and consequences of that interaction?
Yeah, gosh, I cannot speak from personal experience, but I would imagine it would be nothing short of jarring. You're already in a very heightened emotional state if you're on trial, if you are testifying, like you said, you're not feeling like yourself, you're using your vernacular. There's a lot of stuttering that gets studied in this, the online speech elements of you say or like, or write your little pieces of being nervous, and to change out those words, I think you're missing it both lexically and semantically. You're not addressing what they've said, you're not being correct because they've used the word lease, that is the correct word. Then you have the issue of credibility that even comes in when you're changing up the words as an interpreter, especially when if you go back to the problematic ideology of be a machine as a translator, it's not great, but in that sense, it should be, because they said the word lease, and you're totally discrediting it.
I think so much of the craft relies on, like, either you interpreting or translation. A lot of the certificates out there, they rely on static language, jargon, being universal.
Oh yeah.
Right, and
It's
it
universal.
rejects all, well, there's no room for any variation, which is the reality. And what you're advocating for is not undoing it, but you're saying, let's keep it local, let's pay attention to dialect, which is really, really hard when the profession is so resistant to stepping outside of the standard.
And it's not to say that a standard is wrong. It's not to say that standardization does not serve a good purpose. but to have a standard that is flexible enough to be functional and accessible to the people who are operating under it, right? Because if your standard is inaccessible and it's creating issues like this, maybe some of the people who are the problem is the standard.
Anybody else have any questions?
I have one other question. So obviously, even just one instance of this happening is too much. And I'm not sure how difficult it would be to actually find data on how often this occurs. But I'm curious if in your research you did come across any statistics or numerical data that shows how prevalent this has been, if that number has changed as, different laws and things have happened in our history throughout time, throughout hundreds of years, but then also more recently within the 21st century.
Yeah, I searched far and wide to find those numbers, unfortunately. The studies you see up here, these were done by researchers, right? And so the only time that these errors are getting caught because of the lack of checking and balancing, the lack of enforcement. They don't keep their transcripts from Spanish, so you can't retroactively go back and say, well, that doesn't look right. And you don't have anybody in there in the moment who can go, that wasn't right. And so we don't have that data because people haven't even recognized that this is an issue. We have case law, so we can see that Rebron case where the man was not receiving any translation. And we're seeing today, when we have a Federal Interpreters Act. So you can see that ideally, it surmises that there is an improvement, but we don't have hard data on improvement, on how many people how many people are going to be needing interpretation, how many people are getting this, that's how many people are getting adequate interpretation, versus how many people have an interpreter on the phone with crappy phone service while they're in the middle of a local trial. They haven't studied it because the systems themselves aren't even set up to regulate when people fail, because they just certify and release them into the world. And that's definitely something that needs to change for research and further study on this subject beyond just working with individual interpreters and systems to make it accessible.
I think not to mention only informal interpreting translation.
Oh gosh, yeah.
When people take these forms in English, they'll have their family members or their kids fill it out for them. I think there's a larger picture that foreign language is really pervasive in English.
Well, my last question for you, and if anybody else has any questions, we're closing it out. But leading off of that, I'm curious, Olivia, what is one of your biggest takeaways from all the time and energy that you spent thinking about this as you move on from your undergraduate studies? What are you taking with you?
If you're going to speak a language, know the people who speak it. Because you're not going to be able to help. You're not going to be able, we might, right? But if you really want to make a difference, if you really want to do something, do it well. Don't halfway do it, right? Because especially when it comes to something with this high stakes and with the career that I'm looking at long term, I want to make a difference, and I'd rather it be one that I can go back and I can look at. And if there's a transcript of what I said in Spanish, I can go, yeah, I know what I said and I know why I said that, and I can back it up because I wanted to serve this person to the best of my ability. And I think that should be a standard that we're holding for people. So to do things well, to do things well.
Thank you. Are there any last questions?
No.
All right.